Part 1. The Silence of the North. There is a silence in the great northern forests. Silence so vast, so total, that it becomes a sound of its own. It presses down on you, through the fur of your hood, through your ribs, until it settles somewhere deep in your chest. It's not the kind of quiet you find in a church, or the hush that falls before a storm. It's heavier than that. It's the quiet of an ancient place that does not care whether you exist. Up here, in the long shadow of the Arctic wind, the world has been stripped to its most basic elements: cold, darkness, and endurance. Every living thing that survives in this place does so by the narrowest margin, clawing for heat, for food, for breath. The air is so sharp it burns your lungs, and every sound feels like a trespass. The snow does not fall like it does in the south. It drifts slowly, endlessly, filling the world grain by grain until it buries time itself. The trees stand locked in a frozen choir, their branches bare and black, their roots gripping the sleeping ground like fingers refusing to let go. You begin to understand why the people who lived here never called this land dead. To them, death was movement, decay, rot, change. This stillness was something older, deeper, a kind of suspended life that listens. The Algonquian-speaking peoples, Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, Mi'kmaq, have walked these forests for thousands of years. They know the difference between silence and absence. The forest to them is not empty. It hums with spirit. Each tree has a will. Each gust of wind has intent. Even the snow has memory. They move through it not as conquerors, but as guests, careful not to offend the host. They have stories for every shadow, songs for every river, and prayers for every animal they take. In their world, survival is not victory. It's conversation. Every breath is borrowed, every meal repaid. They live by a law far older than any written by man. Take only what you need. Leave offerings for what you take. And never, ever let greed take root. Because greed is not just a sin here. It's a contagion, a sickness that calls something from the forest, something cold and ancient, something that feeds on the breaking of that law. When winter deepens and the rivers lock themselves under glass, the nights become longer than memory. The stars hang low, and the moon, pale, distant, casts light that isn't warmth, but an imitation of it. In those months, even the wind grows teeth. It scrapes across the skin, peels away the layers of comfort, and tests what remains. The cold is not your enemy. It's a mirror. It shows you the shape of your endurance and what happens when endurance runs out. Because there comes a moment when the stomach shrinks and the firewood dwindles, that hunger stops being a feeling and becomes a presence. Hunger in the north is a god. It does not punish. It does not reward. It simply waits. It sits inside your body, quiet at first, a gentle ache, a hollow. Then it grows. It whispers. It tells you that survival is a kind of faith. And faith, up here, has a price. Days blend into nights, nights into something colder than sleep. You stop counting. You stop speaking. The sound of your own heartbeat becomes the only rhythm left. The snow, the wind, the stillness, They merge into one. It's not long before your mind begins to shape meaning from that silence. You start to think you hear voices, the creak of trees speaking your name, the shifting ice forming words in the dark. And maybe it isn't madness, maybe it's memory. Maybe the forest remembers every voice that ever walked it, and now it's just speaking them back. But then, in that deep white world, you realize something worse. The silence isn't indifference. It's invitation. It's waiting for you to answer. Because this place does not take life. It trades for it, and the only thing it ever asks for in return is warmth. The firelight flickers against the snow walls. A lone traveler sits inside a small circle of orange, the only color in a world made of black and white. He listens, not to the crackle of the wood, but to what lives beyond it. The sound of breath that isn't his own. The quiet shifting of something large, slow, patient. He knows he's not alone. He never is. No one truly walks the northern forests alone. Because here, in the great cold, hunger has a shape. It has eyes that glint like frost in the dark. It has a voice that moves through the pines. And it waits for that one moment, that single trembling second, when desperation becomes permission. That is when the whisper begins. Soft, familiar, like your own thoughts turned against you. It tells you to survive. It tells you that rules are for the full-bellied, that the forest doesn't care what you eat, only that you live long enough to feed it back. But then in that deep white world, you realize something worse. The silence isn't indifference. It's invitation. It's waiting for you to answer. Because this place does not take life. It trades for it, and the only thing it ever asks for in return is warmth. The firelight flickers against the snow walls. A lone traveler sits inside a small circle of orange, the only color in a world made of black and white. He listens, not to the crackle of the wood, but to what lives beyond it. The sound of breath that isn't his own. The quiet shifting of something large, slow, patient. He knows he's not alone. He never is. No one truly walks the northern forests alone. Because here, in the great cold, hunger has a shape. It has eyes that glint like frost in the dark. It has a voice that moves through the pines. And it waits for that one moment, that single trembling second, when desperation becomes permission. That is when the whisper begins. Soft, familiar, like your own thoughts turned against you. It tells you to survive. It tells you that rules are for the full-bellied, that the forest doesn't care what you eat, only that you live long enough to feed it back. You close your eyes. You try not to listen, but hunger has patience. It will wait until your morality freezes solid, until all that remains is the echo of your pulse and the simple truth that the warmest thing in the world is flesh. And when that thought takes hold, when it blooms in the mind like frost spreading across glass, something ancient and patient begins to move through the snow. They say you never hear it coming, that by the time you do, it's already inside you, that the Wendigo does not walk to your door. It walks through it because it doesn't live in the woods. It lives in the hunger that's already there. But then, in that deep white world, you realize something worse. The silence isn't indifference. It's invitation. It's waiting for you to answer. Because this place does not take life. It trades for it. And the only thing it ever asks for in return is warmth. The firelight flickers against the snow walls. A lone traveler sits inside a small circle of orange, the only color in a world made of black and white. He listens, not to the crackle of the wood, but to what lives beyond it. The sound of breath that isn't his own. The quiet shifting of something large, slow, patient. He knows he's not alone. He never is. No one truly walks the northern forests alone, because here, in the great cold, hunger has a shape. It has eyes that glint like frost in the dark. It has a voice that moves through the pines, and it waits for that one moment, that single trembling second, when desperation becomes permission. That is when the whisper begins, soft, familiar, like your own thoughts turned against you. It tells you to survive. It tells you that rules are for the full-bellied, that the forest doesn't care what you eat, only that you live long enough to feed it back. Part 2. The land that births hunger. The boreal forest stretches across the northern crown of the continent, an unbroken ocean of green and white, older than the memory of nations, older than language itself. It begins where the farmland ends, and the world loses its color, where the rivers stop singing and begin to whisper, where even the light seems to hesitate before entering. This is not a landscape that welcomes. It does not invite. It tests. The people who once lived within it, the Algonquian-speaking nations, did not call this place wilderness. They called it home. They understood that to survive here was not a conquest, it was an agreement, renewed each day through respect and restraint. To hunt was to ask. To eat was to thank. And to take more than one's share was to break the most sacred law of all, the law of balance. In this world, everything is alive. The stones, the trees, the rivers, the storms, each has its own will, its own awareness. The people are not above them, not masters of the earth, but one part of a vast living system. They are threads in a web woven by unseen hands. The forest, in return, provides. Its bounty is generous. Berries that burn with sweetness in the short summer, fish that shimmer like liquid silver, moose that move through the trees with the quiet nobility of ghosts. But the forest also remembers, and it does not forgive carelessness. When winter arrives, the trees stop breathing. The lakes freeze, sealing away the world beneath. The people gather close, building lodges sealed with bark and faith. They share stories while the fire crackles. Stories about spirits that watch, spirits that hunger, spirits that punish those who forget the law of respect. Among these stories, one name lingers longer than all the rest, a name spoken only in low voices, as though saying it too loud might call it near. Wendigo. The Wendigo is not a creature born of one body or one moment. It is born from imbalance. It is what happens when the circle breaks, when greed replaces gratitude, when hunger replaces humanity. It waits in the heart of the forest like a reflection in frozen water. You cannot see it directly. You only see what it wants you to. A movement in the trees, a whisper that sounds like your own breath, a shape where there should be none. To the Algonquian peoples, the Wendigo was not a monster that stalked from the shadows. It was a sickness, a spiritual disease that could take hold of anyone, given the right conditions. Isolation, starvation, desperation, and worst of all, greed. A person who ignored the sacred balance, who hoarded food while others starved, was said to be becoming Wendigo. Their eyes would grow cold, their heart restless, their voice hollow. They would dream of snow and bone and hunger, and one morning they would wake up no longer themselves. In that transformation, the forest was not punishing them, it was reclaiming them, turning the human body back into what it always was, a vessel for the land's will. Because here, hunger is not just survival, it is communication. It is the voice of the world saying, "You have taken too much. You have forgotten your place. You are no longer one of us." And once that judgment is passed, there is no mercy. In the great silence of winter, when the caribou do not return, and the ice grows thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps, the line between the living and the spirit world grows thin. It is said that, in this season, the forest listens more closely. The old ones used to say, "Be careful what you think when you are hungry, because hunger has ears." To starve in this land is to be seen by the spirits. They watch you measure your humanity one mouthful at a time. And when the fire burns low and your breath fogs the air, they whisper their promises. They promise warmth. They promise strength. They promise survival. But every promise has a cost. For those who live by the rhythm of this land, the cost is always the same: to forget the circle, to consume what must never be consumed, to trade the warmth of love for the heat of hunger. That is how the Wendigo enters, not through the door, through the heart. When spring finally returns, it brings more than warmth. It brings questions. It brings ghosts. A man stumbles from the forest alone, his family gone, his eyes sunken and wild. He says the winter was cruel, that hunger took them all. But the people do not ask how he survived, because they already know. He no longer dreams. He no longer speaks to the trees. He no longer feels the cold. He is not one of them anymore. He is something else. And when he sleeps, his breath fogs the air, even in the warmth of spring. The elders whisper that his heart has turned to ice, that the spirit of the forest, the spirit of imbalance, now walks within him. This is not superstition, it is law. The law of consequence, the law of hunger, the law of the Wendigo. Part 3. The moment the line breaks. The stories say it begins quietly. Not with madness, not with screaming, not even with pain. It begins with a single night that lasts too long. The lodge is sealed against the wind. Snow has swallowed the world. The people inside are shadows wrapped in blankets, breathing the same air again and again until it tastes of smoke and despair. Outside, the forest has stopped moving. Even the wind has frozen in place. It is as if the sky itself has forgotten what warmth means. Inside, time starts to dissolve. They mark the days by the wood they burn, by the sound of the fire dying. Each log that turns to ash is a heartbeat lost. They ration what little food remains: boiled bark, frozen marrow, the ghost of nourishment. At first, the body resists, proud, stubborn. But hunger is patient. It waits. It does not argue. It whispers. The first whisper is soft, a thought that slides in unnoticed, like frost creeping over glass. A thought that says, "You will not die here." The second whisper comes when the fire grows low. It says, "You could live if you wanted to." And by the third whisper, the voice no longer feels foreign. It sounds like your own. It tells you that rules are for the full-bellied. for those who have never stared at death with open eyes. It tells you the forest will understand, that the spirits will forgive, that this is not evil, this is survival. And perhaps you believe it, perhaps you need to, because by now, the sound of your stomach has become the sound of prayer. Your dreams are full of warmth, red, soft, human warmth, the smell of smoke and skin, and when you wake, that same smell lingers in the air. It is everywhere. It clings to the blankets, to your hands, to your mind. The smell of something you once loved. The smell of something still alive. It happens slowly. One night, one breath, one trembling decision. And then, it is done. The body accepts what the mind cannot. The teeth close. The warmth spills. The silence changes shape. You expect the world to collapse, for the gods to strike you, for the spirits to scream your name, but they do not. The fire crackles, the wind moans, the snow continues to fall. Nothing happens. And that is the worst part, because in that stillness you begin to feel it, a pulse beneath the hunger, a vibration in the marrow, something entering. It doesn't hurt, not yet. It feels like warmth returning. It feels like life coming back. But the warmth moves wrong. It spreads upward instead of inward. It climbs the spine, coils around the heart, and whispers in a voice that is not quite yours. More. That word becomes your breath. It beats in your chest. It hums in your bones. You do not eat to live anymore. You live to eat. The act itself becomes sacred. Each bite is prayer. Each swallow a promise. And the thing inside you, the thing that has finally woken, is listening. They say that once the line is broken, the transformation begins, not all at once, but in layers like ice forming on a river. The flesh grows thin, the eyes sink, the heart slows, and the voice changes first. It drops to a rasp, hollow and strange, as if every word is being pulled from the depths of a frozen lake. You hear yourself speak, and it sounds like someone else. Then comes the cold, not the kind that bites the skin, the kind that bites the soul, the kind that no fire can reach. It starts at the fingertips, spreading until your blood feels heavy and still. You press your hand to your chest, expecting to feel a heartbeat, but all you find is silence. Something else beats now, slow, deliberate, mechanical, the rhythm of a thing that does not belong to you. And then comes the hunger, not in the belly, but in the mind. A hunger that eats thought. It strips away memory first, your name, your face, the laughter of your children. Then it eats reason. It tells you that morality is weakness, that love is a luxury, that mercy is death. You begin to see the others not as people, but as movement, as heat, as opportunity. You begin to see yourself as something new, something liberated from guilt. By then, the transformation is complete. The Wendigo is not born from magic. It is born from logic. The brutal, perfect logic of survival unbound by empathy. The people who find what remains months later never speak of it. They see what the hunger has done. The bones stacked neatly by the fire, the marks of teeth on bone, the silence that clings to the air like fog. They know what name to give it. They know what it means. They know that the Wendigo is not an intruder. It is a mirror. Because the Wendigo is not punishment. It is revelation. It shows the face that exists beneath the mask of civilization, the face that still lives inside every human being, waiting for the moment when need outweighs love. The Wendigo is what happens when the body forgets that it ever had a soul. Part 4. The Spirit of the Cold. There are winters that kill slowly and winters that kill completely. But there are also winters that do not kill at all. They transform. They say that when the Wendigo walks, the forest goes still. The snow begins to fall in perfect silence. The moon glows blue, as if reflecting the hunger below. It is said that the air itself grows brittle, so cold it begins to ring, as though every breath is a note in a song no one wants to hear. The Wendigo does not arrive with violence. It simply appears, a shape too tall to belong to man, too thin to belong to life. The trees bow slightly as it passes. The stars seem to dim, and for a moment you can feel the world exhale, as though it's relieved to see one of its own again. Because the Wendigo is not foreign to this land. It is this land. It is winter given form. It is the spirit of starvation, loneliness, and imbalance, wrapped in the remains of what once was human. Its body is a contradiction, a monument to excess and deprivation. It grows taller the more it feeds, but thinner, emptier, as if its hunger carves it from the inside. The ribs stretch like the bars of a cage. The bones creak with each step. The eyes glow with a light that is not warmth, but reflection. It is always moving, because to stop would be to feel the hunger. And the hunger is all there is. But there is one truth that terrifies even the shamans. The Wendigo remembers. It remembers the shape of a hand once held. It remembers the sound of its own name. It remembers warmth, but not how to feel it. And that memory drives it mad. It wanders the forest like a thought that refuses to die. Each step is a question. Each breath, an echo of the human voice it lost. It does not hate the living. It envies them. It sees the glow of firelight in distant lodges and stands outside in the snow, listening to laughter it can no longer understand. It presses its hands to the frozen earth, trying to remember what it meant to pray. But prayer is warmth, and warmth is gone. This is the curse of the Wendigo. It consumes everything but satisfaction. The more it eats, the hungrier it becomes. The more it grows, the emptier it feels. It devours and devours, but the void inside is bottomless. It is a living paradox, a being that proves that the greatest torture is not starvation, but the inability to ever be full. The shamans knew the Wendigo could not be killed like any other creature. A spear could pierce it. A bullet could break its bones. But as long as its heart of ice remained intact, the spirit would return. The only way to truly destroy it was to melt that heart, to burn it in a sacred fire until it became steam, to let it rise back into the sky from which it fell. That was not execution, it was release. The fire was not punishment, it was mercy. Because the Wendigo, at its core, is not evil. It is grief made eternal. It is hunger that wanted to end and could not. The elders said the cold was not the enemy. It was the teacher. It revealed what warmth truly meant. Not the warmth of fire or flesh, but the warmth of connection, of balance, of restraint. To live without that warmth is to risk becoming Wendigo, not in body but in spirit. A person can walk under sunlight, laugh, work, love, and still be hollow, still be cold, still be feeding on others in quieter ways. The Wendigo is not always seen in the snow. Sometimes it walks in daylight. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it calls itself progress or civilization. Because greed has many disguises, and hunger does not end when the stomach is full. The Wendigo's lesson was never about cannibalism. It was about consumption. It was a warning carved into the bones of winter. Take too much, and you will become the thing that takes forever. Part 5. The Colonial Winter. They came when the rivers were still frozen, when the sun lingered in the sky, but no longer gave warmth. From across the great ocean, they arrived, pale, shivering, dressed in heavy cloth and conviction. They came not to listen, but to speak, not to learn, but to name. And each name they gave was a small act of erasure. They called themselves the Jesuits, les robes noires, servants of a distant god, who burned brighter than any northern star. They believed this wilderness to be the edge of the known world, a vast frozen canvas waiting for their brush. To them, the people of the forest were souls adrift in darkness, their drums and ceremonies the whispers of devils. They carried crosses of iron and pages of Latin scripture, holding them as weapons against what they did not understand. But the forest was already holy. It did not need their prayers. The Algonquian nations, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Mi'kmaq, had lived within the rhythm of these lands for countless generations. They knew that the world was a breathing thing, that every creature, every river, every gust of wind carried a soul. They knew hunger and reverence in equal measure. They knew that to take without thanks was to invite imbalance, and imbalance was the doorway through which darkness entered. When the Jesuits arrived, they tried to explain this balance. They said, "You cannot own the land, you belong to it." The priests frowned, confused. They said, "Man has dominion over the earth." And in that moment, the first crack appeared, not in the ice, but in the shared language of what it meant to live. The priests built churches on burial mounds, their bells ringing where the wind once carried the voices of ancestors. They cut sacred cedar for crosses, unaware they were felling living spirits. They burned masks that had spoken to the unseen for centuries, believing they were destroying superstition. They baptized children in icy water, telling them that their own gods were false, that the forest was silent, that salvation came only from beyond the sea. But the forest listens. It remembers. And when it remembers, it does not forgive. At first, the land resisted quietly. The hunts began to fail. The rivers froze earlier, thawed later. The sky turned heavy and gray. The air itself seemed to withhold its mercy. Men went missing beyond the tree line. Their trails ended in spirals of broken branches as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The Jesuits wrote about this in their journals. They described a malady of the mind, a possession by a spirit of gluttony and despair. They called it le démon du Nord. They said men had begun to eat their kin. They said they saw madness in the eyes of those who survived the cold. They did not know the word Wendigo, not yet. but they were already feeding it. Then came the story that would stain the snow forever. The story of Swift Runner. He was a Cree guide, tall, strong, respected. He worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police. He spoke both languages, walked in both worlds. He was trusted until one winter he returned from the forest alone. He told them his family had starved. He said he had tried to save them. But when the Mounties went to his camp, they found what his words had hidden. Bones cracked open for marrow, a skull blackened by fire, a pot slick with fat that was not from any animal. They hanged him in 1879, calling it justice. But justice does not end hunger. The old people whispered that killing him did nothing, that the spirit had already left his body and entered the world of men, that it had found a new home in greed, in power, in conquest. The priests could not see the irony. They wrote that the devil had possessed the savages. They said the Wendigo was a demon of cannibalism, proof that pagan lands bred corruption. But they did not understand. They themselves were the carriers. They hungered for land, for souls, for dominion. They devoured culture and called it conversion. They ate language and called it education. They swallowed entire nations and called it civilization. Their hunger was endless, and like all hungers that forget gratitude, it began to consume even them. As the fur trade spread and forests fell to axes, the Wendigo changed shape. It no longer needed famine or snow. It learned the taste of profit. It grew fat on exploitation. It took on new forms. The merchant who hoarded wealth while villages starved. The officer who traded blankets steeped in disease. The politician who promised peace while stealing land. Every act of greed whispered the same invocation, and the spirit listened. The Jesuits documented what they saw, but only through the eyes of their faith. They wrote of a demon that tempts men toward gluttony, of possessions curable through exorcism and the cross. They believed they were saving souls, but they were cataloging their own infection. The Wendigo had outgrown the forest. It had learned to speak Latin. It had found a home in the heart of empire. As decades passed, the myth faded into anthropology. Professors wrote of psychosis instead of spirits. Doctors measured hunger in calories instead of prayers. But deep down, the people of the North still heard it. In the moaning of trees in winter, in the echo of hunger that civilization could not silence. They knew that the Wendigo was not dead. It had simply changed its diet. Today, the descendants of those First Nations still tell the story by firelight. They tell it softly, as snow drifts past the windows. They say the Wendigo no longer walks only in the forest. It moves through boardrooms and cities, its eyes glowing behind glass towers, its breath fogging the mirrors of those who take without giving back. It wears suits now, drives cars, signs contracts, and smiles while the world burns. They say every skyscraper is a monument to its hunger. Every oil rig, every clear-cut mountain, every empty promise. A shrine to the spirit that learned to eat without tasting. And when the wind howls through the streets of Toronto, of Montreal, of Chicago, the elders close their eyes and listen. They say it sounds just like the old stories. They say the Wendigo still speaks through the storm, still asks the same eternal question, how much more will you take before you begin to eat yourselves? Because the Wendigo was never a monster. It was a mirror. And the cold it brings is not from the air. It comes from within. Part 6. The Age of Silence. When the stories stopped being told, the cold did not end. It simply learned to move quietly. There was a time when every breath in the forest carried a lesson, when every elder could still name the sound of hunger in the wind. But time, like ice under pressure, begins to crack. And memory, when not spoken aloud, turns brittle. This is how silence begins, not with forgetting but with exhaustion. The colonists had built their towns. The traders had moved on, the missionaries had died, their crosses leaning like bones in overgrown clearings. The people of the North, those who still carried the old stories, were left with the ruins of their language, the ghosts of their gods, and a quiet that pressed against the ribs like grief. They were told to move, to adapt, to modernize, to stop talking about spirits, to believe in reason, in progress, in industry. The world, they were told, was no longer alive, only useful. And so the forest went still. The lodges went dark. The Wendigo waited. The silence began in classrooms. Children were taken from their homes, their hair cut, their tongues punished. They were told their stories were savage, their songs sinful. They were given new names, new prayers, new gods. They were told that hunger was only a matter of food, that despair was only weakness, that the cold in their hearts was something to be ignored. But when they closed their eyes at night, they could still feel the weight of it, that ancient breath watching from beyond the window. The Wendigo did not need to haunt the woods anymore. It lived in their dreams, in the ache of their silence, in the hollow space between who they were and who they were forced to become. It grew fat on the absence of stories. Because the opposite of fear is not courage, it is forgetting. And forgetting is the soil in which the Wendigo thrives. By the late 19th century, the world had new priests, scientists. They came with notebooks instead of Bibles, measuring skulls, timing heartbeats, collecting words like specimens. They studied hunger, madness, and ritual, filing them into categories: psychosis, superstition, cultural trauma. They believed they were naming truth, but all they did was translate mystery into silence. They looked at the Wendigo and saw only metaphor, a curiosity, an anthropological footnote. They said it was a form of hysteria, that starvation could drive a man to cannibalism, that isolation could fracture the mind. They used the word pathology. They used case studies. They used charts. And in doing so, they stripped the soul from the story. But the forest does not care for definitions. It does not recognize Latin. It knows only balance and its absence. It knows the sound of greed, as well as it knows the sound of a dying branch. And in the quiet that followed the scientists' reports, the Wendigo smiled. Because to name a thing without understanding it is another kind of hunger. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Wendigo had been buried beneath psychology and progress. The world had found new hungers to worship. Men no longer prayed to gods. They prayed to growth, to speed, to steel, to the glittering lights of cities that never slept. They believed themselves safe from the cold, surrounded by electricity and glass. They forgot that the Wendigo had never been a creature of the forest alone. It was a condition of the soul, of civilization, of appetite, unbound. And civilization by then had become the hungriest thing the world had ever seen. The Wendigo adapted again. It learned to hide behind comfort. It wore the skin of progress. It whispered through advertisements, through the promises of endless wealth, endless pleasure, endless more. It taught people to consume without thought, to measure their worth in the things they devoured: food, love, land, each other. And every time a man chose excess over empathy, a small part of him froze inside. The Wendigo did not need the forest anymore. It had found its new home in the modern heart, in the far north, where the last elders still remembered. They spoke softly of the change. They said the Wendigo had grown invisible, that it no longer left tracks in the snow but footprints in the mind. They said it whispered through machines, through glowing screens and humming wires, offering 1,000 ways to feel full and not one to feel alive. They said this new Wendigo was harder to fight because it came dressed as desire. It didn't tear flesh. It offered distraction. It didn't hunt in darkness. It flooded the world with light. It didn't scream. It scrolled. And the people forgot what true hunger felt like. They forgot what silence was supposed to teach. There are still moments, though, when the old world stirs, when the power goes out, when the city goes still, when the wind slips through the cracks of windows at night. That's when you can feel it. The ancient quiet pressing in, the breath of something waiting, just outside the circle of light. You might call it anxiety, you might call it emptiness, you might call it loneliness. But the elders would know its true name. They would say the Wendigo is near. They say it lives in every man who forgets gratitude, in every woman who forgets gentleness, in every leader who forgets humility. They would say it feeds on those who believe they are above hunger, for they are the ones who never stop eating. But not all silence is loss. Some silence is the beginning of remembering. And in recent years, the old stories have begun to breathe again. Young voices speak the names their grandparents were forced to bury. They write, they sing, they film, bringing the Wendigo back into the light, not as a monster, but as a mirror. They remind the world that the myth was never about cannibalism. It was about imbalance, about the danger of forgetting that every act of taking must be matched by an act of giving. They remind us that the Wendigo is what happens when a society feeds only itself. In the end, the story always comes back to the same lesson. The forest remembers, and so must we. When the last storyteller dies, the Wendigo becomes a metaphor. When the next storyteller is born, the metaphor becomes a warning again. And so the cycle continues, a rhythm of forgetting and remembering, of silence and song. Because the Wendigo does not vanish when unspoken. It waits. It listens. And every time we say there is no such thing, it smiles. Because disbelief is the sweetest kind of silence, the kind that lets it grow. And maybe if you stand alone one night in the snow, you'll hear it too. Not as a growl or a scream, but as a sigh carried through the pines. A sound like a question. Do you remember what it means to be hungry? If you do, truly, deeply, then it will pass you by. But if you don't, if you try to fill that question with noise and comfort and denial, you'll feel the cold slip beneath your skin. You'll feel it settle behind your ribs. You'll feel it whisper, not from the forest, but from within. And then you'll understand what the elders meant when they said that the Wendigo is not a thing you see. It's a thing you become. Part 7, The Shaman's War. They say there comes a moment when the world you see begins to dissolve, when the line between dream and waking blurs like frost melting under breath. That is where the shamans walk, the borderland between firelight and shadow, between heartbeat and silence. The elders said only those who had faced their own hunger could cross safely, because the Wendigo was not a beast to kill. It was a spirit to understand. and the battle began not with a weapon, but with a heartbeat. When the signs appeared, the people knew. The afflicted stopped eating. Their eyes glazed like ice over still water. They muttered to something unseen. At night, they screamed or laughed alone. The air grew colder around them, as if the spirit itself pressed against the edge of the world. The elders whispered, "The hunger is near." And then they called for the shaman. He was not a priest. He was a bridge, one who could walk between worlds and return. He carried fear in one hand and fire in the other. When he entered the camp, silence followed. He brought only what he needed: a rattle of turtle shell and stones, a pouch of sacred tobacco, a drum painted with the four winds, and a knife, not for harm but for cutting through darkness. He knelt before the fire and listened, not to voices but to the silence between breaths. He could smell if the spirit had entered, a sourness of iron and ash, bending even the flames. When the moon stood high, the ritual began. They built the shaking tent, willow branches bent into a spine, covered in furs and skins, sealed tight. It was no home for men, but a doorway for spirits. Before entering, the shaman let them bind his wrists and ankles with rawhide, proof that what came next was no trick. He crawled inside, his breath slow, his voice low. The people sat in a circle outside, holding small coals of fire. No one dared to speak. Then came a sound, a hum, steady as a heartbeat, growing layer by layer until the air itself began to pulse. The shaman's voice rose within it, calling not to gods, but to allies: the bear, the raven, the wind, the ancestors. Words older than history, older than hunger. He called for balance. He called for mercy. He called for warmth to meet the cold. Inside, the air thickened. The tent shook, groaning like a living thing. The people heard scratching, voices that were not the shaman's, the cries of animals and the snapping of wood. The rawhide cords broke one by one, but the structure held, trembling as if something were being born. Then came many voices, deep as thunder, sharp as breaking ice. They spoke of sickness, not of flesh, but of spirit. The shaman's soul had gone walking the dark paths, seeking the heart of the Wendigo. In that world beyond waking, the shaman found a forest made of bone. The sky screamed softly. The snow burned with cold fire. He followed the sound of weeping, always weeping, and found the lost soul kneeling by a frozen river, their reflection fading. The Wendigo appeared, not a beast, but an absence. A shadow stretched thin, eyes like hollow moons. It spoke in many voices. It tempted. It begged. It whispered, "Hunger is truth. Balance is a lie." The shaman trembled but answered, "Hunger is sacred when it feeds life. You devour only to destroy. That is your curse." He struck his drum 3 times. The sound rippled through both worlds. The tent shook. The people gasped. And within the dream, the Wendigo faltered, its shape unraveling into snow and smoke. The shaman reached into its chest and took the heart of ice. He lifted it to the sky and whispered, "Fire without flame. Melt this hunger clean." The ice cracked. For a moment, the spirit remembered warmth. Then it was gone. When the shaman returned, he was trembling, drenched in sweat. Sometimes he wept. Sometimes he slept for days. Sometimes he did not wake at all. If the ritual worked, the afflicted stirred, changed but alive. If it failed, the shaman would nod, and the people would understand. There was only one cure left: fire. They led the possessed into the clearing. The shaman gave them water, one last taste of balance. Then he pierced the chest, sorrow in his eyes. He removed the frozen heart, white, steaming, heavy, and placed it into the sacred fire. They watched until it was gone, until the last hiss turned to breath. No one cheered, no one prayed. They only listened to the wind, waiting for the silence to change. That was the shaman's burden, to hold madness in one hand and mercy in the other. He knew the Wendigo could never truly die. As long as there was greed, as long as one man believed he was worth more than another, the hunger would rise again. But each time someone faced that darkness and returned with love instead of appetite, the balance tilted back, if only for a heartbeat. And that was enough. Because healing was never the end of darkness, only the remembrance of light. When the shaman died, they said his spirit walked the northern lights, a figure of smoke and fire still beating the drum. And on nights when the sky moves like breath, the elders tell their children, "Look, the shaman's war continues. The Wendigo has not won yet. As long as someone keeps singing in the dark, the world is not lost. The hunger does not own us. And the silence, though heavy, is only sleepy dying, waiting for the next heartbeat, brave enough to break it." Part 8. The Heart of Ice. There are stories that claim the Wendigo was not truly killed, that even when its body was burned and scattered, something remained, a single frozen fragment of its heart. They say that heart is the reason winter never leaves the north completely, that it beats once each year somewhere deep beneath the snow, reminding the world that hunger is never truly gone, only sleeping. The old shamans taught that every creature, every tree, every gust of breath carries a center, a spark. For humans, that spark lives in the heart. It is the seat of warmth, the home of empathy, the pulse of connection. But when the Wendigo enters, that spark freezes. The heart becomes a stone of ice, hard, brilliant, unfeeling. It doesn't stop beating. It just beats without purpose. That was the true curse, not the monstrous size, not the endless appetite, but the hollow rhythm of a life that could no longer feel love. A heart that could pump blood but not compassion. That is what terrified the elders most, because once the warmth was gone, there was no way back on your own. When the hunters found a body that had frozen in the woods, they would look first to the chest. If the ribs were cracked, if the skin around the sternum had split, they would say the Wendigo had come to reclaim its peace. If they found a lump of clear frost in the ashes of a campfire, they would whisper, "He tried to melt it himself." Because there were those who knew what was happening, who felt their hearts growing cold and tried to fight it. Some walked into the forest to be alone, hoping that solitude would burn the infection away. Some prayed until their voices froze. A few succeeded. The legends say they became shamans, guardians, half alive, half spirit, forever carrying the memory of that icy heartbeat inside them. The heart of ice was more than a curse. It was a symbol, a mirror held up to humanity itself. Because what is greed if not the slow freezing of empathy? What is domination if not a refusal to feel another's pain? The Wendigo's heart wasn't just in one creature, it was in anyone who could watch suffering and stay still. In every man who mistook ownership for strength. In every nation that learned to take without remorse. Every frozen empire began with someone whispering its only survival. The old people said that a frozen heart doesn't just kill the one who carries it, it chills the world around them. It spreads like frost from one generation to the next, until the rivers forget how to flow warm. That is why they burned it, not out of hate, but out of mercy. Fire was the only medicine powerful enough, not just physical flame, but the fire of truth, of grief, of song. When the shamans spoke of melting the heart, they didn't mean destroying it. They meant remembering. To remember suffering is to thaw it. To weep is to let warmth return. That's why the rituals were filled with tears. Because crying was proof that the ice had not won. In the stories, when the Wendigo was slain, its body was dismembered, and from its chest, the heart of ice was carved. They placed it in a sacred fire and watched as it hissed, cracked, and finally vanished. Only when the last wisp of steam had faded did the shaman close his eyes and whisper, "Now the world is safe again." But the world was never safe for long. In the modern age, the heart of ice has taken new shapes. It beats inside offices and screens, in those who measure value only in numbers, who see forests as profit and people as resources. The Wendigo no longer howls in the woods. It hums in the fluorescent light of corporate towers. Its heart glows blue instead of white, cold pixels instead of frost. And we wear it willingly. We call it ambition, drive, pragmatism. We call it the way things are. But when night falls and the noise dies, the silence feels the same as it did centuries ago. That heavy, watchful quiet where warmth once lived. The elders still speak of one test. They say if you want to know whether the Wendigo has touched you, close your eyes in winter and listen. If you can still hear beauty in the snow, if you can still feel pity for the starving bird or the dying tree, then your heart is still alive. But if the world feels small, if others feel distant, if every sound is dull, then a frost has already begun to spread inside you. And the only cure, the only one that ever worked, is to feed something else before it's too late. Feed kindness, feed gratitude, feed the warmth you still have. Because the heart of ice is patient. It doesn't rush. It waits for silence. And it grows when you forget to love. In the north, when the first snow falls each year, some families still light a small fire at the edge of the woods. They don't pray to any god. They don't ask for protection. They only sit and watch the flames. They say it's a way of reminding the world and themselves that not everything burns to destroy. Some fires burn to remember. Some fires burn to keep the ice from returning. And as the sparks drift into the cold night, you can almost imagine them as tiny hearts beating against the dark, each one whispering the same ancient promise. So long as one heart stays warm, the Wendigo can never truly win. Part 9. The Prophecy of Hunger. The Wendigo was never just a story about the forest. It was a story about us. A warning whispered across centuries in a language made of snow and silence. And like all warnings, it was ignored until it was too late. The old hunters feared the deep winter because it tested the body. But the modern world faces a different cold, one that tests the soul. It does not freeze flesh. It numbs empathy. It does not kill quickly. It erodes quietly. And though we no longer live among wolves and endless white, we still feed the same hunger that once haunted those lonely lodges of the north. We have built our own forest now, a forest of glass, metal, and light. It hums instead of howls, but its rhythm is the same. Endless repetition, endless taking. We have traded the howl of wind for the static of machines, but the spirit that moves through it is ancient, patient, and familiar. The Wendigo no longer waits beyond the campfire. It lives in our reflection. It lives in the quiet moments when we scroll without purpose, consume without need, and call it living. It feeds on attention now, not flesh, but the emptiness it leaves behind tastes the same. Civilization once promised abundance. It delivered appetite. We wanted more comfort, more speed, more connection, and we got them, but at a cost too subtle to notice until it became unbearable. Now, even surrounded by plenty, we starve. Starve for meaning, for stillness, for warmth. Our bellies are full, but our hearts have turned to ice. We tell ourselves that hunger is progress. We worship it. We glorify those who take without limit, who build higher, dig deeper, own more. We call them successful. We call them visionaries. But the old people would have called them possessed. They would have said the Wendigo walks with them. Look closely and you can see it everywhere. In the markets that rise and fall like fevered lungs. In the forests burned for profit. In the oceans stripped bare. In the cities that glow so bright they can no longer see the stars. You can see it in the way we speak. How the word enough has vanished from our vocabulary. You can hear it in the restless heartbeat of the modern world, a rhythm that never slows, never rests, never remembers. It's the same beat that echoed in the frozen chest of the Wendigo, a pulse without purpose, a life that cannot stop feeding. The elders once said that every story carries a medicine, that even the darkest ones contain a seed of healing, if you're willing to listen beyond the fear. The story of the Wendigo was that medicine. It taught that hunger was sacred, but only when it led you toward life. That taking must always be balanced by giving. That warmth is not weakness and restraint is not shame. But we forgot. We replaced the medicine with distraction. We traded ceremony for consumption, and the sickness grew. There is a word some indigenous philosophers use now, Wendigo. It is the modern name for the ancient disease, a spiritual plague that spreads through greed, through colonization, through systems built on endless taking. They say Wendigo is not a spirit from the woods, but a virus of the mind. An idea that teaches people to consume everything around them without ever feeling full. To see others not as relatives, but as resources. They say Wendigo is what made empires, what drove ships across oceans to claim lands already lived in, what built industries that chew through forests and economies that measure worth in destruction. They say Wendigo is the world we live in now, and the world that might devour itself if it does not remember how to stop. The prophets of old did not wear robes. They wore frost on their lashes and smoke on their breath. They warned that when greed replaced gratitude, the balance would break. They warned that when the fire of compassion went out, the cold would come not from the sky, but from within. That was the real prophecy of the Wendigo. Not a monster stalking the woods, but a civilization becoming one. a species that forgot how to listen, how to give thanks, how to feel enough. And maybe that's why the story survives, because it isn't finished yet. Sometimes, when the northern lights stretch across the sky, the old people say it's the world remembering. They say the colors are the breath of spirits, singing to the living. Be careful with your hunger. The lights shimmer like veins of fire in the cold heavens, a reminder that beauty and terror have always been twins. If you listen closely, you can almost hear a rhythm beneath the wind, a slow heartbeat, deep and ancient, echoing from the buried heart of the earth. It beats for us, warning, waiting, forgiving. It says, melt what you can, feed what is still alive. Remember, we are not doomed. That is the part people forget. The Wendigo was not a prophecy of extinction. It was a test. A question whispered in the snow. How much can you take before you lose yourself? And the answer was never meant to be despair. It was meant to be a choice. Because even the coldest heart can thaw. Even the deepest hunger can be turned toward life. That is what the shamans fought for, not to destroy the darkness, but to remember the light that lives inside it. If the Wendigo is our reflection, then salvation is not in exile, but in recognition. We cannot kill what we have become. We can only melt it. We can only learn to feed differently. Not on the world, but for it. Maybe that's what the story was always trying to tell us, that the forest and the city are not opposites, but mirrors. That every time we forget our place in the living web, the hunger grows stronger. That every time we remember with gratitude, with restraint, with awe, a little warmth returns to the world. And maybe that's all it takes. A single heartbeat thawed, a single fire lit, a single story remembered. Because stories are the opposite of hunger. They don't consume, they connect. They remind us that even in the darkest winter, we were never meant to feed alone. The cold will come again, it always does. And when it does, we will gather, as we always have, around whatever fire we can find. We will listen to the wind whisper through the trees, and someone will tell the story of the Wendigo again. Not to frighten, but to remind. That hunger without heart becomes ruin. That silence without memory becomes death. And that the cure for both is simple and hard and eternal. To love what you eat, to thank what you take, and to never forget that the world feeds you back. Subscribe and walk deeper in the dark.